It was today in history in 1969, the little girl named Sally moved into a brand new neighborhood of New York City and encountered a friendly teacher called Gordon, who was just the guy to introduce her to the inhabitants of her new street, Sesame Street.
And it begins, as you say, Rebecca, with this little girl, Sally, who looks totally bemused, being led around by this rather sort of, it's like over-the-top jovial guy who's trying to introduce her to absolutely everyone and everything that lives in Sesame Street.
Classic pilot TV thing, though, isn't it? Let me introduce you to every character that you're going to meet as the audience.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and she sort of meets like the mum hanging out of the window, and she meets some of the other kids who are playing on the street. And then in comes Big Bird.
Big Bird, look up.
And realism is disrupted.
Right. And so you've got this quick skit that ensues about Big Bird being such a big bird that she can't see. He or she? What is Big Bird?
Oh, that's a whole separate episode.
Okay,
I think
right.
we'll settle on he, because Carol Spinney inside is a man.
Fine. So Big Bird can't see this little girl because she's so small. And then that quickly segues into a bit of Bert and Ernie, who are just inside one of the buildings. And Bert asks Ernie,
"Why do you call your bathtub Rosie?"
"Because every time I take a bath, I leave a ring around Rosie."
So that's kind of the level of humour you can expect from Sesame Street for the next however many decades.
Yeah, I don't know if we needed to really go into detail of what the plot was, you know, like sort of Cliff's Notes for the first episode of Sesame Street, which no one's ever going to see again. I mean, the point is that the show hits the ground running, right? All the hits are there. Cartoons about the letter O, counting exercises with ice cream cones, Ernie singing in the bathtub. But that was only the result of kind of 16 weeks of mad rearranging of what they'd spent 3 years, the Children's Television Workshop, kind of very carefully putting into place to hit every educational psychology note that they wanted to reach the diverse audience of children that they needed to engage. They spent 3 years researching until July 1969, did a pilot, screened the pilot for kids who were all really bored, and they thought, oh God, we've got this wrong. So actually it's amazing that they managed to get it so finely tuned by this point.
Yeah, they actually ended up making 5 test episodes purely to show this, you know, pre-selected test audience of preschoolers, just to make sure that everything was right. And the show's writer, a guy called John Stone, he was also a producer, he's credited with really shaping that tone that would come to define Sesame Street over the course of this fine-tuning, you know, with this sample audience. And it was these test sessions that resulted in one crucial decision, which was to integrate humans and Muppets, who had initially been restricted to separate segments, because there was this sort of, the adults' idea was that mixing them up might confuse the children, but actually when they showed the episodes to the children, they had no problem sort of wrapping their heads around the fact that this was a universe where children lived alongside Muppets.
Yeah, because the scale is something that as a grown-up you look at it and you think, how does Big Bird and Bert, how are they even on the same planet? Like, they're completely out of proportion. One's a bird, one's a man, but the man's smaller than a child and the bird's bigger than an adult. But kids just don't think like that, do they?
No, yeah, and it works. And that's where the producers Joan, Ganz, Cooney, who is a former public television documentary producer, and Lloyd Morissette, who is a psychologist who worked for the Carnegie Corporation, came in. Cooney had actually been challenged at a dinner party as to whether you could make entertaining shows for kids that were also educational. And this is what she came up with.
Yeah, so also at that dinner party was Morissette, who was recounting to the audience of friends around them that his young daughter would watch the test patterns on their TV in the morning. So addicted was she already to watching stuff on telly. Wow. And there was nothing of educational value for her there, but she was learning stuff anyway, because kids of that age at preschool are like a sponge. And he said, my daughter knows the tune of every like cheap car jingle that's on the TV in the ad breaks. Using the techniques that they use, could we instead create something for the common good rather than to sell something? Could we get children singing songs about letters and numbers rather than ads for sugary cornflakes? And that's essentially Sesame Street, isn't it?
Yeah, and they were talking about this particularly in the context of inner city kids, because there was already research at this time showing that, you know, majority Black and Hispanics kids in New York City were going to school less prepared than their majority white suburban peers, and that this inequality then, you know, sort of persisted throughout school. And there was an idea of whether TV could help close the gap. Again, there was research suggesting that working class kids spent more time watching TV than their middle class peers, you know, where their parents were out working. So they were missing out not only on the development development that better off children were getting from having parents who had more time to talk to them, read with them, take them out, etc. But, they realized that economic reality wasn't going to change anytime soon, but maybe something that could change was the content on TV, helping to maybe close that gap rather than widen it. But it was a bit of an uphill battle because educational TV just wasn't a concept at the time. TV was something kids watched to occupy them after school. There was no concept of the idea that TV could or should have any responsibility to, not rot children's brains.
Yeah. Well, so to make sure that they weren't going to rot kids' brains, Cooney and Morissette set up the Children's Television Workshop. And actually, in the early days, it actually was a series of workshops or seminars where they got in, led by a Harvard professor called Gerald S. Lesser, all of these experts to tell them how to build the best possible children's show that they could. And actually, through the course of this series of workshops or seminars, they actually came into contact with Jim Henson. And of course, it's Jim Henson who is the absolute key to Sesame Street, not just ending up as a very earnest and well-meaning, but actually completely entertaining and great fun show, because...
Otherwise, it's just counting without someone going, ah.
Right, yeah. But as they found in those early test screening episodes, the kids really liked the bits with the Muppets, and they didn't so readily get into the stuff that was set on Sesame Street itself. Of course, they realized that they needed the Sesame Street thing to link it all together. One of the writers called the street scenes the glue that held the show all in one place. And I think that whole business is why they eventually came up with these Muppets that lived on Sesame Street, on the street of Sesame Street, including Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch, because they could actually have this interface with the children that then they could go to the sequences that were inside, like the Bert and Ernie scenes that were just Muppets, and they sort of created that link.
But Oscar, I think, really crucially, because he lives in a trash can. There's sort of implicit message to children is, this is a bit of a shithole, Sesame Street, but look, everyone has a nice time. These people learn about numbers and colours at home, even though they don't have all the resources that everyone across the country might have. I mean, the sets literally had rubbish on them. They looked authentically grubby inner city streets, and then the population on them as well, African American and Latino people, Mr. Hooper, who was clearly Jewish. You had this kind of melting pot idea. You could watch this from home and feel like you are being reflected within it. Although that seems so blindingly obvious in the 2020s, in 1969, that really had not been done before. Black people were so rarely on television. I mean, it's one thing in the United Kingdom, but in the United States, when you had a huge African-American population, black people were so rarely on television that at this time, Jet magazine was still running a sort of weekly kind of TV guide as to the shows that would be featuring African-American performers that week. Here's where you can see Eartha Kitt, here's where you can see Sammy Davis Jr., and here's a TV show where the majority of the cast aren't white.
Yeah, and I mean, that part of that was because most children's TV was either set in the countryside or squeaky clean post-war suburbs. If you think about like Leave It to Beaver, that kind of thing. It was a really radical statement to say that the inner city could be a setting for wholesome things to take place, not just something for a horrific crime drama. Even the opening sequence of Sesame Street, you see this multiracial group of children, they're running along past this, really drab wall covered in graffiti. They're playing in front of a concrete apartment block. They're not trying to sanitize the setting in any way. They're saying this is where people live, but they are still having like these, lovely childhood experiences. They're still learning. Yeah,
sunny days are available to everyone, aren't they?
Friendly people. But to be fair, this very integrated picture of American life was not charming to all viewers. In Mississippi, the only public TV station in Jackson refused to air it, and it wouldn't have been available to viewers at all had a local commercial station not picked it up. Not everybody wanted their children to be seeing this sort of emerging vision of America.
The State Commission for Educational Television decreeing that the state's viewers were, quote, not ready to see black and white kids playing together on screen.
Wow. I mean, with the exception of Mississippi, this first season went down incredibly well. It was widely praised for its originality. The show actually reached only about 67% of the nation, but it was estimated that 7 million children began watching it every day in that first season. It also turned out that according to the Educational Testing Service, children who watched the show started scoring higher in tests than less frequent viewers. So it was also working in that pure educational sense that it had been devised for. It won a Peabody Award and 3 Emmys in 1970. Cooney. President at the time, Richard Nixon, sent Cooney a congratulatory letter, and Benjamin Spock predicted that the program would result in better trained citizens, fewer unemployables in the next generation, fewer people on welfare, and smaller jail populations.
The issues that Sesame Street has gone on to tackle are incredible. Death, bullying, racism, adoption, AIDS, autism, fostering. I mean, it's amazing, but at the same time, it is for 4-year-olds. And I do think, yes, you can demonstrate, and there is actually academic papers that demonstrate that children, even when they get to university, might be more fluent than the average for their age group if they have, or rather than have not, been watching Sesame Street at preschool, which is amazing. But nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily mean I don't think that their values are going to reflect all of the happy clappy values of the Children's Television Workshop. I mean, Joan Ganz Cooney once said, "My dream is one day that Arab and Israeli children will be at a negotiating table together, and one of them will say to another some line of Bert and Ernie's, and peace will break out in the Middle East."
It's got real Justin Bieber and Frank House vibes.
Yeah.
And so ends another curious moment from history. Subscribe now to hear more from Arian, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.